Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my regular update from the Capitol. Been another busy week on a whole host of fronts. I want to spend my opening comments mostly on the issue of artificial intelligence. I mean, as a former tech guy, I've seen tech innovation happen over the last 30 years. Usually what happens is the tech promoters talk about it, and it normally takes a lot longer to happen. I think about the internet. I think about even in my industry, the wireless industry. I think we may be seeing on AI the opposite, that the rate of change and the rate of disruption is accelerating even beyond what the proponents thought as recently as 6 or 9 months ago. AI is here. We're not putting this genie back in the bottle, and it's going to change virtually everything. How we work, where we work, how we interact with technology. Could bring great efficiencies and research, but it's also, as we've seen from social media and other innovation, it's got some downsides. So let me get into the way I've been thinking about AI, and I've issued this week a series of legislative proposals, bills, discussion drafts to try to move this debate along, because if we don't act quickly, as in months, not years, we could be left behind. First is an issue that is already red hot in Virginia, and that is data centers. So I believe there needs to be a federal minimum on data centers. States can then, or localities can then do beyond, but that federal minimum ought to include making sure these data centers don't add to the consumer's electric bill, either bring their own power, it ought to be clean power, or find ways to guarantee no increase in electric rates. There ought to be, make sure there are appropriate uses of water, and hopefully a lot of newer data centers have cooling systems that reuse that water. There ought to be setbacks from neighborhoods. There ought to be making sure that the backup power is also clean and reliable. We've seen in Loudoun County some cases where it's not. And one of the things I think that is driving people the craziest is that if the community oftentimes may not know what the local government's given up. So I think before you can make any agreement to give any benefits to these data centers, all the non-disclosure agreements need to be disclosed so the community can make the judgment. And what I would use as the hammer, in a sense, to make sure that these standards are met is that these data centers should not be able to claim what's called either accelerated depreciation or bonus depreciation until they hit these standards. Now, that wouldn't raise the company's taxes. It would just say you should not get this huge federal tax benefit up front until you meet these standards. So this is a good, I think, federal guideline. It's coming to every state that we are already happening in Virginia. I heard this morning both battles in Kansas and Georgia. So I think getting at this is very important. The second is the whole question around consumer protections and choice. I believe very strongly that the U.S. government should not purchase any AI models that allow, for example, chatbots that can lead kids to self-harm, that allows non-consensual nudes. If we think social media messed with our kids, AI tools can be exponentially more damaging if we don't require these companies to put some guardrails in place. Combined with that is the whole use of what are called agentic AI agents. This is where and I've been talking about this literally since the late teens, more around social media, but it is where you basically turn over to a AI agent the ability to make your schedule or potentially buy stuff for you. And there needs to be, again, some rules. If we don't make sure that AI agents can access all the models, we could end up again where the big tech companies dominate, and your AI agent might not be able to access Anthropic or OpenAI's models unless you met their standards. There needs to be full interoperability standards, but there also needs to be a duty of care. And I believe even a fiduciary duty that the agent has to you as a consumer. This is going to be, it's just emerging. It's going to be a huge area, but we need to get in front of it in terms of standards around AI agents. The third area is around national security. We saw with Anthropic's issuance of Mythos, huge concerns amongst the national security community and frankly the banking community and others that, oh my gosh, this tool could find enormous vulnerabilities. I misspoke at one point, didn't break into all of our classified systems, but it did find huge numbers of vulnerabilities that could lead to an exploit. So I strongly believe that we should have some level of mandatory pre-testing, just as you wouldn't put a new car on the street or a new drug on the street without some prior safety testing. We cannot just leave this to the goodwill of some of these tech CEOs. I even think the administration is changing their view and moving towards this standard as well. And if we need any further evidence, we just saw yesterday OpenAI's next model, 5.6, literally jumped. They were testing it in their own what's called testing ground. It jumped the rails, and this model on its own went out and penetrated Hugging Face, another AI company. So the idea that these tools could jump safeguards and go after other companies with or without direction, if you're not concerned and scared about that, you ought to be. And what's happened in the last 48 hours reinforces this need that we've got to have some entity that ultimately has some government participation that's making sure that there's some seal of approval on these models before they're released to the public. And then finally, something you've heard me talk about in the past, what's going to happen with our economy? What's going to happen with jobs? I very much believe, I still accept the notion that AI will bring positive changes. I even believe AI will create jobs in the long run. But over the next 2 to 5 years, I think there's going to be huge disruption. There will be some gains. I actually think there's going to be a lot of gains in the traditional trades. Plumbers, electricians, others who will work on both the power generation or the data centers. And I think the building trades unions are actually doing a very good job on training and ought to be included in that discussion. But a lot of folks who thought their future was going to be in traditional finance or traditional corporate, those jobs I just fear are not going to be there. So I'm introducing legislation that would create a workforce transition fund that would potentially give tuition relief or rebates for careers that we know are not going to be immediately affected, changes in terms of workforce training programs, a comprehensive approach. And the tech companies have to help pay for that, whether it be through a token tax or whether it be through what I'm suggesting is, again, deferral of accelerated depreciation until they make these contributions. Because quite honestly, we're not even 100% sure what we should be training for. I think I may have mentioned this on an earlier report to you guys that, if you look at most universities, the top majors are business administration, and econ. Maybe we could get a third of those people into the healthcare fields, doctors, nurses, PT, technicians, caregiving. Those are fields that are not going to be immediately dismissed, and we have huge, huge shortages. So how we drive our training towards where the jobs are going to be is critically important. I'm anxious. I think we'll know by September or so how many folks who graduated even in this calendar year in 2026 have actually found jobs by the fall. And it'll be a very important data point. And one of the things we don't do is even collect good data on this. So I've got a bipartisan bill that would say that BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, would start collecting this information, not just jobs created by AI, not just in terms of people getting fired by AI, but also people that are not getting hired. That's where I think a lot of the transition will come. And we've got to get through this next 5 years where we could have huge disruption, and the innovation that could come from AI could be literally stymied by popular pushback from both, this is not a partisan, from both the left and the right. So I hope my AI agenda will be taken up. I'm happy to work with anybody in either party to try to get this done. The one thing we cannot do is do nothing. If we are having this same conversation without any guardrails a year from now, we have failed the American people miserably, and we may be frankly in a no-return position. lots of other things I want to touch on. One other issue I've raised this week, and it's again another example of corruption and graft from this administration. And I scratch my head because if any other time in recent history somebody had proposed this, it would be front page news, and it's been barely mentioned. President Trump, with his personal megaphone, his Truth Social. Truth Social is where he posts his rants, but he also posts things that oftentimes move the markets. How many times over the last couple months have we seen, after the stock market went down on a Sunday night, President Trump will say, hey, we've got a new truce with Iran. Obviously, as we see the war re-rage, those posts have often not been true, but that posting on Sunday night oftentimes moved the market on Monday morning. So what President Trump is now saying is he is offering, I believe for $100,000, any entity to get that Truth Social post early. Folks, this is classic insider trading. If other folks get access to insider information and the president can move markets early, that is illegal. It is corrupt. So I have written all of the banks, all of the securities firms, all their trade associations, all the high-frequency traders, which are particularly adept at using this kind of information, and implored them not to sign up for this scam. The problem is some probably will, and they will front-run the market, and normal investors will get cheated. It is as basic as that. And it shows with the almost daily drip, drip, drip of corruption stories. This didn't make gain as much attention as I thought, but this is classic insider trading. I'd point everybody to The Big Short and some of the other, issues around corruption in the financial system markets. This is being done in plain sight in an obvious way, and it needs to stop. Lots of other issues, but I see I've already gone to 12 minutes, so why don't I turn it over to Catherine and be happy to take your questions.
Senator, our first question is from Mitchell with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us, as always. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to get back to your legislation, specifically related to the data centers. It sounds like you do not feel that they have been transparent enough, and I wonder if you could just talk about it a little bit more in connection with the proposal that you have with the Data Center Tax Accountability and Disclosure Act, requiring them to provide more information to communities as they expand.
Well, I was a governor, and I was a strong advocate for economic development. And traditionally, companies don't like to advertise about where they're trying to locate. I get that. But before a county board or anyone else agrees that if you come data center to X county or community, we company, data center company, will give you these benefits. Before any of that is signed, you need to get rid of these non-disclosure agreements. And that has happened in virtually all of the siting of these centers. And, they do bring in a lot of revenue. So, taxes in Loudoun County are about a third cheaper than Fairfax County, and a lot of that is due to the tax revenue. But communities ought to make that judgment. And too often, what has been hidden has been the electric use, been the water use, been the backup power, been all the things that the rest of my bill looks at and says we need to set the minimum federal standards before a company gets a federal tax break, which is what bonus depreciation is.
Okay, sir. Our next question is from Ethan with Wavy.
Yep. Good morning, Senator. Appreciate you taking some questions here. You've already kind of touched on it, but could you once again just kind of go over how the Data Center Tax Accountability and Disclosure Act just really keeps the best interest of Virginians and residents in mind?
Well, this isn't, what I'm trying to do is set a federal standard. What I don't want is a race to the bottom. And I don't think the moratorium is going to put a genie back in the bottle. And candidly, if there are communities that still want these because they want the revenue, whatever, they ought to have that ability to decide. But there ought to be the federal standards, and that ought to be around, again, power usage to make sure that you don't have increased utility bills. It ought to be around water usage. It ought to be around appropriate setbacks from neighborhoods. We've seen, particularly in Northern Virginia, Oftentimes, these data centers locate literally right next door to a neighborhood. I don't think that should happen. The backup power, which is, not been a huge issue on the front end, but again, I look at Loudoun County, where some of these data centers have, frankly, they use their backup power a lot, and you have enormous amount of fumes that come in that could or could not be potentially hazardous. And you need to make sure that there's full transparency to a community before they say yes or no. And I think you need a hammer, and that hammer is, we're not going to give you this bonus depreciation, which basically allows you to write the whole cost of the data center off, oftentimes in the first year, until you meet these standards. So I think it would set a floor if states or localities wanted to go beyond that. I know we've had that debate in Virginia. I think my act would grapple with that. Let me also quickly add, we do need, and whether it be Virginia or I think on a national level, we need a revenue source from these hyperscalers or big AI companies. I've never seen a level of investment that's taking place. I hope it's not a bubble, but not billions, but literally trillions of dollars are being spent. I do not accept the fact that we couldn't carve off a piece of that revenue stream that could go into the retraining or skilling of people who either lose their jobs or frankly don't get hired in the first place. And unlike what happened with globalization, and we lost kind of oftentimes low-skilled jobs, but it took place slowly moving over a 5 to 10 year framework, this is going to happen, I believe, in the next 2 to 5 years at a huge rate. All of the investors who put these trillions of dollars into these data centers to increase productivity are going to expect a return. And all this money is not being spent to cure cancer. Their AI could help cure cancer because it accelerates research, but it's also going to try to drive more profitability from companies. And I believe in the market, but I think that increased focus on profitability is going to mean less people working. And and we still have to, again, I don't want to go on forever, but we still need to figure out what to train for. We know some communities won't be, or like healthcare or education or caregiving, they're not going to be eliminated, but we need to move more people there and incent folks. But some of the technobabble that comes out of the AI companies, we want to make jobs AI adjacent. I'm not sure what that means. I have to speak to every group, and I say, I will bet you that we'll have 30% college undergraduate unemployment within 2 or 3 years. I hope I'm wrong, but if I'm not, we need to deal with the job front, the data centers front, but we also need to deal with the national security issue of pre-testing. And while this is not a cutting-edge issue today, I believe, even by Christmas this year, you're going to have the number of Virginians and Americans that use AI agents to buy Christmas presents raise huge concerns. Who is that agent responsible to? Is it responsible to the model, to the consumer? What happens if you get all this stuff and you don't want it? It wouldn't be great if we actually got ahead of one of these issues rather than chasing after the fact.
Sir, our next question is from Tyler with WRIC.
Thanks for doing this, Senator. I wanted to go a little further on this pre-testing requirement. Who would be doing that testing, and what exactly would they be looking for in these models? And then you mentioned Congress has to act in months and not years. What's the timeline on getting some of these proposals passed?
Well, let's take the second one first. I implore, members in both parties to let's get on this. I fear that it may take some catastrophic event before we act. So I'm going to keep pushing, but Tyler, you'd be right to point out that Congress's record of moving quickly unless there's a crisis is pretty poor. And again, I would point a classic example of this is we still don't have a kids online safety legislation for social media. So I'm going to push. I want to stay optimistic that we can move quickly, but I recognize the reality. And you asked exactly the right question, Tyler, about who is going to be on that testing review panel. You do need a governmental entity like NSA, the National Security Agency, so that we can make sure that we are not going to undermine our national security. You need the AI companies themselves, the frontier models. You're going to need certain industry. the timeline, the bid and the ask is between 30 and 90 days. Potentially, it could be a 60-day, and there is an already existing model in the financial services area called FINRA, where you've got a group of the industry it's called a SRO. They do some level of testing first, but you still have a government backstop in case the model is really dangerous. The exact components of who's on that review panel is where the rubber hits the road, and I'm open to better ideas than mine about who on there, but there ought to be a national security component. There ought to be NIST, which is the standard setting body we already have in the Department of Commerce. But we are going to need both industry and industries being affected. I'll give you a quick example. Sorry to go on so long. Recently, when Mythos was issued, and Anthropic, and I give them kudos. I know the CEO. He reached out to me and basically said, "Mark, we're creating something we don't even fully understand all the ramifications." They proactively shared that with the government. They also put together a group of key industries in a project called Glasswing. I think they did a pretty good job, but boy, oh boy, did I hear, I heard from allies, our key allies, saying, well, why aren't we getting exposed to this as well? I heard there were a lot of people from finance on the Glasswing project, nobody from the insurance industry, and they rightfully said, well, gosh, we provide, catastrophic risk insurance. Shouldn't we be on? So getting right who's on that panel is going to be part of the sausage making, but we may not get it right at first, but we got to get it there. And I would even point out the administration, who at first were saying, no guardrails at all, pedal to the metal. We got to beat China. I believe we got to beat China too, but this is not going to slow innovation. But even they, after Mythos came out, and by the way, there's been 5 new models since Mythos has come out, and pulled back when the next iteration was called Fable came out because of the potential downside ramifications. Sorry for go on so much, but I'm pretty deep in the weeds here. But this is boy, oh boy, if we don't get this done, get it done quick and get it done right, and even if we have to come back and correct later, the national security ramifications, the financial ramifications, the economy-wide ramifications of these models jumping the fence and getting out before they're ready. And I just point to the OpenAI 5.6 jumping the OpenAI security fence and literally penetrating another AI company called Hugging Face. You can, in the tech press, you can read about it all the time over the last 48 hours.
Sir, our next question is from Tad with Cardinal News.
Morning, Senator. I had another question for you, but I got to pivot based on some news that came out today. I hope I have time for 2 questions, but here's the first one. Google has decided with its data center campus in Botetourt County to go with at least one of them being electricity power, air-cooled as opposed to water-cooled. And obviously with drought conditions here in Southwest Virginia over the past few months, there's been a lot of public pressure coming down over there about their use of water. And I'm curious about, with your legislation, how do you see sort of the way that data centers should approach cooling?
Well, why don't you go ahead and ask the second question, too, and I'll answer them both at once.
Okay. My understanding is the Trump administration has released or is going to work on shifting money away from universities and toward individual researchers for study and innovations in areas such as AI. And obviously, we've got FBRI down here and a lot of other university research that gets federal dollars for funding. Curious your response to that.
Yep, great. Let me take the Botetourt County. I don't know the details, but it sounds to me if the company is reacting to think air-cooled rather than water-cooled, that makes sense to me. And if that is technologically possible in Botetourt, then it could potentially be used elsewhere. So that's why we need a federal standard about what the water usage effect of a data center would be to the overall watershed, to water rates. I think in the Roanoke Valley, you guys have done some good reporting that overall water usage frankly, has been down over the last 20 years because of different kind of flush toilets and stuff. So this is an area we can make progress in, but that is exactly the kind of standard we need. And I think at the federal level, and a county could adjust or not, but most counties don't have the technical expertise to go toe-to-toe with these AI companies. So that's why I think we need power, water, setbacks, backup power, and full transparency. On the question of its so-called Genesis project, I'm actually supportive of what the administration is trying to do, as long as it doesn't, take money from other programs. Take money from NIH or take money from a National Science Foundation to fund this effort. I've been assured it doesn't, and I would point out that just yesterday I was talking to literally 600 scientists from around the country who've won a lot of these Genesis grants, and Virginia Tech led a coalition was one of the winners. So, the original promise of AI was going to be it should be able to speed up innovation, and Dario Gil, the Deputy Secretary of Energy who oversees this whole project in the national labs, pointed out a new plane that had been developed like 50 times faster, 20 times cheaper, because you could condense a lot of the simulation and pre-testing in terms of using AI tools. So I think we need to use these AI tools, but it shouldn't rob other good research programs. And it also needs to be, all of this still needs to have peer review. The thing that I'm most frightened on this Trump administration is their overall cuts in research. But on top of that, if they let politicization into standards or into basic science, and I think I fear that, particularly out of the health sector. So I'm in on the goals of Genesis, as long as it doesn't take money away from other projects. It should actually save money if you could speed up the research. But all of this still needs to be peer reviewed and not politicized. And I will quickly add also, just as an aside, we're talking about Virginia Tech, but I should point out the fact that this kind of effort is going to be really good for the High Performance Computing Center at Jeff Labs. Very, very important for its future, and we're glad to have gotten that recognition and money as well.
Sir, our next question is from Allison with ABC 13.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for taking time to talk with us today. A recent audit by the Office of Inspector General revealed some serious issues with delayed USPS mail and a lot of other things here in Lynchburg specifically. I know you've advocated for improvement in the past, but it just seems like things are just not improving. So my question for you is, are you going to investigate the results of this audit, and will you be taking steps in the next weeks or months to look for solutions for these continued issues?
Well, the short answer is yes. There is some good news out of this audit. It came out with 7 specific recommendations, and I think all of them are being implemented. It all comes back to retention of personnel. I think in the Lynchburg area, only about 40% of the new hires stayed, or maybe they lost. I'm sorry, I think I got it wrong. 60% stayed, but 40% quit within a fairly early period. You can't have that kind of turnover in the Postal Service. And the old idea that the post office job, gave you great benefits and a long-term security, I think people are moving away from that, particularly since in many communities, a starting worker at Chick-fil-A gets more money than a starting postal worker. So we have to increase the wage base, or we're not going to keep people. I would point out, again, because we've seen this slowness in delivery, packages and others, like we found in the Lynchburg case. People didn't even know how to scan packages. You got to have more training. But this is obviously, as you know, not a new issue. We've had this problem in Charlottesville, where it was a disaster when Richmond was used as a guinea pig for a whole new system. I've had it in Williamsburg. This is a nationwide problem. Virginia has borne more of the brunt of this. And what is particularly galling to me is Trump's first Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy. I had real problems with it first, but he was constantly responsive to me, Senator Kaine, and others. And I actually think he was starting to turn the corner on getting the Postal Service back profitable and operationally a better place to work. And, ironically, even though he was a Trump appointee from the first term, literally within the first few months of the second Trump administration, the Postmaster General was fired, and I believe the new person is much more a political appointee rather than somebody that was working enterprise-wide. I mean, the Postal Service, first-rate class mail has gone down dramatically, pay has not kept up. We have to build a new model, but a lot of that, for the short-term answer for Lynchburg, I am going to do further investigation, but the good news is the Lynchburg region has already implemented most of the recommendations of the OIG.
Senator, our next question is from Nick with Radio IQ.
Hi there, Senator. Just wanted to talk about some of the reporting that if you are elected this fall, it'll be your last term. Can you just talk a little bit about that decision and what has led you to that?
Well, it just, Nick, there's always a time. We got to bring on the next generation of leaders. Been my honor of my life to be governor and senator. There were a number of reasons why I decided to try and ask Virginians to hire me one last time. A lot of it is due to the fact that I think on particularly national security issues, my experience, particularly in terms of technology competition with China, is terribly important. I also believe, as I outlined, I don't think there's any senator that's more in the weeds on artificial intelligence and how it's going to change lives. It also means, like, for example, I very much believe we have to move to a universal health care system in this country. That wasn't my position years ago. I thought we could still patch up the old system. But as we see costs continue to go up, I think we have to start with basic universal health care, and then we can focus on cost containment. When we keep arguing only about, who's going to get covered and who's not, I am also still very committed to following through since I was governor, making sure that rural Virginia is not left behind, and that means broadband and bringing more jobs. And it also means, particularly at this moment in time with President Trump, I believe, wanting to interfere in our elections. Last Thursday night, I was glad that most networks didn't cover that as news. It was foolish misstatements. And there is nobody more versed on how we protect, how foreigners try to interfere in our elections, and how we can push that back, and more out there talking about preservation of our democracy for these next few years, and with specific suggestions than me. So respectfully, I'm asking folks to hire me, but I also don't want to pretend the game that this is not my last term if I get hired.
Sir, our next question is from Mitch with WDBJ7.
I'm Cross Dune, so good afternoon, Senator, and thank you for taking this question. In Danville, Virginia, there have been a cluster of thefts of SNAP benefits. It looks like we've seen dozens of families and potentially hundreds of people who saw their benefits hit their card and then they just disappeared. They were fraudulently taken through an EBT scan. Now, when we contacted the Virginia Department of Social Services, they said, we need more federal funding in order to reimburse these people for the money that they've lost. And what we look into is that the, authorization to replace stolen benefits expired at the end of President Biden's term. It has not since been renewed during President Trump's term. And you've worked as a governor and a senator, and I am just curious if there is anything
Thank you for the
done to reimburse these benefits or anything these folks can get now, because even the food banks are having trouble keeping up with the demand because of this cluster in Danville.
Well, let me just say, unfortunately, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. I strongly support federal reimbursement of people who've had their SNAP benefits stolen. I strongly support the SNAP program. And we will see, because of the big ugly bill last year, we're going to see enormous amounts of SNAP cuts coming. In the wealthiest country in the world, it is a sin that we have people going hungry, and that will even get worse with the future cutting of SNAP. It's one of the reasons why the Farm Bill, which we desperately need, is being held up, because driven by the Trump administration, they want to renegotiate. There's always a deal between SNAP benefits and ag community that support each other. That is being undermined. And on top of that, let me just say, you add the 310,000 Virginians who are going to lose health care coverage. When Medicaid benefits expire, cynically, they had this cut take place after the elections this year. You're going to have people without health care and without food. That's outrageous. So we need to restore the SNAP benefits. We need frankly, I'm working on federal legislation to make sure there is that ability to reimburse. In the short term, it is going to be. Most communities don't. There's so much stress on them already. I've been a big supporter of the food banks, but they are running thin. At a state, whether there's a chance that a state could provide some reimbursement, I don't know, but that is something that in the past, when you've had a crisis like this, has been dealt with at the state level, as those at the federal level then try to fix it nationwide, because it's not just Danville that this is happening.
Senator, our next question is from Mark with CBS 19.
Hey, Senator. Thanks so much for making the time. Just want to talk a little bit. The House just passed today a war powers resolution with war in Iran. How similar is this to the one in the Senate, and do you plan on voting for it when it comes up with rising gas prices starting to rise again?
Yeah, well, listen, oil hit $100 yesterday. Gas prices are going to keep going up. This is a complete folly. It is a war of choice that Donald Trump chose. He had no plan, and if you look at 5 months in, the regime is worse. We haven't got the enriched uranium. They've still got missiles. And obviously, Iran has a lot to stay over the Strait of Hormuz. And now that the Houthis are engaged, we may even see the passage through the Red Sea cut back. He needs to declare victory and get out, or whatever taco move that he would take. But I will absolutely support this War Powers Resolution Act. And it's our own Tim Kaine who's really been leading this for years. He was even willing, it's not partisan, he was willing to take on President Obama on some of his actions. So this may be the most unpopular war in modern history, even making the Iraq War after years look relatively popular in comparison. And it is a disaster, both economically and geopolitically for us. The military's done its job, but you can't take a country like Iran and simply bomb them into submission. And that's what's happened when you have a war of choice. And I can tell you, as senior in the Intelligence Committee, there was no imminent threat. So absolutely, I'll support the War Powers Resolution.
Senator, our next question is from Dwayne with Cardinal News.
Good morning, Senator. My question concerns the Americans held in Russia. I understand Senator Schumer is circulating a bipartisan letter to Secretary Rubio to push for a wrongful detention designation. Is that something you plan to sign?
Listen, Dwight, I absolutely support the effort to get Chuck Zimmerman, who's got ties to Virginia, put in the category of wrongfully detained. And Tim and I and Ben Klein have written Secretary Rubio, and we want to keep pushing on that. I'm looking at Schumer's letter. I want to make sure, because I do have access to information that others don't, that everyone on that list fits into the category of wrongfully detained. I don't want to give Russia an excuse if they have, if there is a absolute criminal that they've got the goods on that we know is a criminal. We can Chuck Zimmerman and everybody else's case if we include a list that's not been properly vetted. I'm trying to vet Schumer's list right now, and I'll have a decision soon. But on Chuck Zimmerman, I'm all in, and we continue to press.
Senator, our next question is from Noah with WTKR.
Hello, Senator. Thank you for your time today. I wanted to ask about the National Defense Authorization Act, which currently does include a lot of funding for Hampton Roads military installations, specifically in regards to child development centers. And NDAA is typically passed with bipartisan support, but the House vote was largely along party lines. What are the contingencies or provisions that needed to be added or dropped to the NDAA for the Senate Democrats to give support?
It really comes down to two things. We will pass the NDAA this year, I'm sure of it. But we also need to acknowledge, we may have heard about people going hungry in Danville. If we pass all that the president has asked for, $1.5 trillion, where are those cuts going to come on the domestic side? How many folks' health care is going to be ripped away, or food assistance? How much road funding is going to be cut? Because in Hampton Roads, we still got, I often said, we got to finish 64 in my lifetime. We need that next crossing. So the way NDAs pass in the past have been, you get a top line on defense and a top line on domestic. We don't have a top line on domestic. On top of that, I think very much we don't want to indicate support at this higher number for the war against Iran. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that some of these munitions will be running low. The Defense Department has roughly $80 billion of unspent money from a prior bill. If we are running short of munitions, use that $80 billion. And it's disrespectful to our troops and those in harm's way that they're trying to politicize that rather than using the money that's already in the bank and has not been allocated. But I think we'll get there. This is just Republicans in the past have shot down NDAAs because of debates that happened in 2010. It happened in 2014. We'll get this resolved, but we shouldn't have to go through all these hoops.
Sir, our next question is from Layla with 13 News Now.
Hi, good afternoon, Senator Warner. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak about everything today. My question for you is, we know AI is advancing faster than Congress has historically moved on technology legislation, and we know this framework covers everything from national security, which you touched on, to consumer protection and workforce training. Senator, why is this the right time for this legislative package, and what do you say to critics who worry these regulations could slow American innovation, and how certain are you this legislation, if it becomes law, will mandate those big tech companies to truly cooperate?
Well, I think most folks would acknowledge, if we go back 10 years, 11 years, and I had bipartisan legislation, we should have put some guardrails on social media. We'd have a heck of a lot healthier group of young people right now if we did. We missed. I think most of us probably agree, not allowing kids to use cell phones during school day probably makes some sense. So the idea that any guardrails will slow innovation does not pass the smell test. It may come from advocates who make a lot of money off of these AI companies, but it does not pass the smell test. And even most of the more responsible AI companies, and I put in this category, recently Microsoft and OpenAI and Anthropic and Google have all said, particularly around national security, they need this pre-testing regime. And I also think it will be just a disaster if I'm right and we have 30% recent college graduate unemployment and these companies who are literally spending trillions do nothing to help us through that. What will stop innovation will be people will be so damn mad that they'll say, we're going to shut this down across the board, and that would cede this field to China. I think the reason this is really hard to grapple with, these are new issues. I mean, even like the Chinese open source models, they are so much cheaper than our frontier models in America. How do we grapple with that? So I've put out my best beliefs in this package. If there are better ideas, I'll work with anyone. But I particularly see this in national security. Some of our biggest disasters is when we see a security threat and don't act until after the fact. I am very worried that that could be the case with some of these AI models. And unlike prior innovations, when the very people who are innovating are saying to me, hey, Mark, we don't fully understand this model. Shame on us if we don't get it right.
Senator, our next question is from Michelle with Northern Neck News.
Hello, Senator Warner. From the data center bill, you talked about giving communities information for planning and for building decisions. But from reading the bill, it looks like a new data center wouldn't be required to make their first disclosure until 180 days before they go into operation. So at that point, the permitting and the public input in the building would generally be done. So why isn't the focus on disclosure to communities from the beginning of the project?
Yeah, well, I think.
Can you also speak a little bit to?
I'm sorry. What we're trying to. What we're trying.
And can you? I'm sorry. Can you also speak a little bit to any concerns or plans that you have as far as addressing that small rural governments just are ill-equipped to properly assess and negotiate data center projects?
Well, let's start. As you know, as a part-time resident of the Neck, in King George, I care very much about the rural communities in the region, frankly, across the country. That's why, and I think that, I don't think that's a complete reading of the bill. We've tried making this bill before any county government authorized, even the building. You've got to have the non-disclosure agreements. I believe the penalties don't kick in up until 180 days before they're brought on operation. But you've got to have all this information in the public earlier, so that no county board makes this decision without having the full transparency on power, water, setbacks, backup power, and again, let's face it, particularly the further down the neck you go, is a county of 15 or 20,000 people going to have enough revenues and lawyers to take on Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic? I'm not sure. So if we set the federal baseline, I think that'll be a step in the right direction. It'll be a great assistance to all the communities. If they want to go further or add other preconditions, that is fine. What I don't want to have them do is, be bought off with the promise of a sports center, and the community look at the shiny bauble over here of the sports center and not have all the information about power, water, setbacks and so forth. I even think one of the things I'm looking at as well is maybe adding, because there is some chance that we are looking at an AI bubble, and we may overbuild, particularly data centers in rural communities. If they go under, and I've been talking to folks in the industry and the workforce, if they go under for 2 years and they're sitting vacant, it would be incumbent upon the company to take it back to its natural state, and the requirement of potentially a bond being put up to make sure that guarantee takes place is something I'm looking at as well. So I'm still working on trying to perfect all these ideas, but we got to get it into the debate.
Senator, our next question is from Nathan with Seaville Weekly.
Thank you very much, Senator. In recent remarks in Greene County, you said that you didn't want Democrats to embark upon a retribution campaign against the Trump administration if y'all retake the House and/or Senate this fall, that you opposed impeaching the president, but that you wanted to hold him accountable. Do you believe that the president has committed impeachable offenses in his second term? And in practice, what would accountability look like for you as opposed to retribution?
Well, Nathan, I wish you would have been there, and if you would have heard the full answer, even the lady who asked me the question ended up agreeing with me. If we spend all our time, if Democrats win, spending all our time simply trying to impeach the president, where we won't have the votes and won't have the votes to override, I think it's a mistake, because the one thing Donald Trump is an expert at, even though he was born on third base with a rich father, is playing the victim. Nothing could revitalize Donald Trump more than allowing him to play the victim, particularly when it's not going to come to pass. I do think he's created a number of offenses that break the law, and I ultimately want to focus on accountability. I think you will see particularly a lot of investigations of current government officials. That should be held accountable. I particularly, as a former business guy, want to make sure the businesses that have turned a blind eye, particularly on these corruption schemes, are held accountable. That is something, we can still investigate some of the businesses even without the president's threat of veto. And I say this as somebody who's worked closely with the business community. And the corruption levels are obscene. But ultimately, if Democrats are elected and they put all their energy into this action, and not about delivering, if not about moving to universal health care, if not about moving to having a floor of federal regulations on what data centers ought to look like, and not on trying to make sure that research at places like UVA is not cut off and we can fund it back to the appropriate levels. As somebody who's been doing this for a while, we've got to produce for the American people. And as obscene as some of these actions are, we can hold accountable. But if we spend all our time on impeachment as opposed to delivering, I think that would mean, because the real goal here is, because you're never going to roll back all of these Trump actions until we get a new president, and a president that doesn't buy into the MAGA line. And we get the keys, at least from the legislative standpoint. We don't produce. Nothing would be worse for our country than to have a MAGA-type candidate win in 28. And if we don't produce for the American people, if we're only spending on, all our focus on Trump, 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 I just think that's a mistake.
Senator, our next question is from Angela with the Hampton Roads Messenger.
Good afternoon, Senator Warner. Thank you for taking my question. You talked about working in technology previously and how much slower to market timeframes occurred then compared to AI today. Given that data storage limits is one of the few things possibly that can limit AI models from going off the rails, as you mentioned witnessing previously, is legislation limiting the amount of storage these models can use something that is being considered?
I have not heard limiting the amount of storage, because oftentimes these data centers, they work in tandem to create the compute power to kind of do the testing on these models. I'll look at the storage issue, but to date, I've thought, we're not going to stop AI. We're not putting this genie back in the bottle. But I do think, communities ought to have basic federal standards which address the concerns that I hear the most of the time around Virginia about the data centers. I also, again, come back to the point, from pre-testing, but also please hear me as well on the job dislocation. And these companies have to help pay for part of that job dislocation. I've put out some ideas in my legislation. There may be better ideas, but I think we need the whole suite. But I will take a look at the storage issue. I've not heard that one to date as a way. And what I don't want to do, though, is, and let me just back up, we're not, unless we can do on an international basis and work with China, I don't want us to slow the innovation rate. Maybe we could have done that 5 years ago, but if we stopped everything in America, there's enough compute power around the world and in other countries that this is still coming, and I'd still rather have it come from American companies than from potentially countries that are adversaries.
Unfortunately, those are all the questions that we have time for.
That's right.
Today.
Well, I've got to run. Thank you, everyone. I'll get you next week if I didn't get to you today. I apologize. This may be the longest one we've done. Thanks so much.